Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about a little girl named Gloria, who was 10 years old when the whole country decided to watch her lose her mother. It happened in a courtroom in New York, in the autumn of 1934, and for 2 months, it was the story America read over its coffee every single morning. They called her the poor little rich girl. She had a famous last name, a fortune waiting for her, and 2 grown women fighting to keep her. And somehow, in the middle of all that wanting, she was about the loneliest child you can imagine. Get comfortable. I'll keep watch. Before we settle in, the usual small thing. If you enjoy these quiet nighttime stories, you're welcome to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure at all. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always strangely comforting to see who's drifting off alongside you. If you'd rather have this playing with the screen off, the whole thing lives on Spotify as well. It'll be there whenever you want it. So dim the lights. Turn the fan on if that's your thing. Get comfortable, get heavy. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of all this, good. That's exactly the point. I'll still be here, and little Gloria's story will keep just fine until tomorrow night. We'll follow her from the year she was a baby, through the summer that started all the trouble, into that crowded courtroom, and out the far side to the woman she finally grew up to be. You don't have to hold on to any of it. Let it come to you. Our story starts small, the way the real ones usually do. Picture a tall, quiet house in New York City, in the autumn of 1925. Upstairs, a man of 45 is dying by slow inches. Downstairs, a baby who barely knows him is being carried up for her nap, one small fist closed around the collar of the woman who holds her. The baby is not quite 2 years old. Her name is Gloria Vanderbilt, and she has walked into the world holding one of the richest, most watched names in America, which is a heavy thing to hand a person who cannot yet talk. The man upstairs is her father, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt. Reggie, to everyone who knew him. He was the great-grandson of old Cornelius Vanderbilt, the ferryboat sailor who clawed his way into railroads and steamships and became, for a while, the richest man in the country. That was the family Gloria was born into. 4 generations of it. All polished floors and marble halls, and money that arrived like weather, without anyone in the room having to do a thing to earn it. And Reggie, bless him, had made an art of spending it. He was a charming man, by every account. Good horses, good tailoring, a soft laugh. A weakness for the racetrack and for a drink he loved a little too faithfully. There was a cocktail he was fond of, a brandy milk punch, sweet and warm and ruinous. And he had them the way other men have opinions, which is to say, constantly and without much reflection. By the time he married Gloria's mother, he was already a man living on the far downhill slope of his own fortune. He had come into something like $7.5 million when he turned 21, along with the income from a family trust worth about $5 million more, numbers that could have carried a careful man for 6 lifetimes. Reggie was not a careful man. He got through the $7.5 million the way you and I might get through a long weekend, and by his last years he was living almost entirely on the trust, the one piece of the money the family had wisely locked away where even he couldn't reach the bottom of it. His body gave out in September of 1925. The word the doctors used was cirrhosis, the liver simply worn through. And if you've ever watched someone go that way, you know it isn't quick and it isn't gentle. He was 45. His widow, the second Mrs. Vanderbilt, was 20, or thereabouts, and I'll come back to that little tangle of her age in a moment, because it matters more than you'd think. Their daughter was a 1.5 years old. She would keep almost nothing of him but the name, And the name, as it turned out, was the whole trouble. Here is where the money gets interesting, and I promise to make it painless, because you don't need to track a single figure to feel the shape of it. When all of Reggie's debts were paid, and the taxes, and the men he owed, his young widow was left with something around $130,000, a fortune to you or me in 1925, and a rounding error to a Vanderbilt. The real money, the $5 million trust, did not go to the widow at all. It was set aside for the children. Little Gloria would share it with an older half-sister from Reggie's first marriage, and neither girl could touch the principal until she grew up. Until then, there was only the income, the interest, a river of it, but a river that belonged, on paper, to a baby, and a baby cannot sign checks. So the court stepped in, as courts do, and a New York surrogate judge named James Foley was given the job of watching over little Gloria's money. When her mother asked the court for an allowance, something to run the household and raise the child, the judge granted $4,000 a month. Sit with that number for a second. $4,000 a month, in the depths of what was coming, when a working family might see $1,500 in a whole year. That was the allowance. That was the pocket money attached to this one small girl. You can already feel it, can't you? The thing that's going to go wrong. The child was the fortune. The child was the key to the fortune. And a key, in the wrong grip, stops being a child at all. But that's still years away. Tonight, she's just a baby being carried up a staircase, and the lamp is on, and someone is humming. Let the house go quiet. Let me linger on the father a moment, on Reggie, because he set the whole tragedy rolling before little Gloria could even walk, and because he's the kind of charming disaster every old family seems to produce at least once. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was a son of the Gilded Age, at its most golden, raised in the very palaces the Commodore's money had built. And he did with his life exactly what too much money, too young, tends to let a man do. He became a sportsman, a famous horseman, a fixture of the show ring, a judge at the great horse shows, a man who knew everything worth knowing about a fine animal and rather less about a bank balance. He gambled, he drank, faithfully and ruinously, those sweet brandy milk punches that finally dissolved his liver. He was, by all accounts, wonderful company, generous, warm, the sort of man everyone was delighted to see walk into a room and no one wanted to lend money to twice. He'd been married before, to a woman named Kathleen, and he had an older daughter from that first marriage, so little Gloria was not his only child, only his last and littlest. And the money, oh, the money. When Reggie came of age, he was handed a fortune outright, something on the order of $7.5 million, and a separate trust of $5 million more that the family, in their wisdom, arranged so that he could only ever spend the income, never the principal. And thank heaven they did, because Reggie went through the outright millions like water through a sieve. Horses and cards and hospitality and drink. And by the time he was in his 40s, there was almost nothing left of the part he could touch. Only the locked trust remained, the piece meant for his children, and it was the income off that trust that the whole rest of our story would be fought over. He died in the autumn of 1925, 45 years old, his body simply worn through, leaving behind a young widow, a baby, a famous name, a pile of debts, and one locked box of money with a child's name on it. He was gone before little Gloria could form a single memory of his face. All she inherited from her father was the situation, and the nursery lamp is turned down low. 2 floors down from where Reggie was dying, there was a woman who mattered more to little Gloria than anyone with the name Vanderbilt ever would. You'd have liked her, I think. Most people did, once they got past the starch of her. Her name was Emma Keislich, and if that's a mouthful, don't worry, because nobody used it. The baby couldn't manage it, and what came out instead was Dodo. So Dodo she became, to Gloria and to the whole household, and, in the end, to history. Dodo. Say it, and you can hear a child saying it. Dodo was the nurse. She had been hired when Gloria was 2 weeks old, a tiny, fresh scrap of a person, still red from being born. And from that first day, Dodo did not miss a single one. Not a day, not a night, for years. Think about what that actually means. Because it's easy to say and hard to picture. Every fever, every bad dream, every scraped knee and lost tooth, and thunderstorm at 2 in the morning. It was Dodo's face that came, not the mother's. The mother was, more often than not, an ocean away. Dodo was the one who warmed the milk and checked under the bed and sat in the dark with her hand on a small back until the crying wore itself out into sleep. If you have ever been the person a child reaches for in the dark, or been the child doing the reaching, you already understand the whole rest of this story. The law would spend 2 months and 100 reporters trying to decide who little Gloria belonged to. Dodo had settled the question years earlier, quietly, at 3 in the morning, one warmed bottle at a time. There was a second woman in that small, warm circle, and her name was Laura. Laura Kilpatrick Morgan, little Gloria's grandmother on her mother's side, a handsome, iron-spined woman with strong ideas about everything and a particular gift for grievance. Laura loved the child fiercely. She also, and this is the part that will ache later, came to feel that the child was hers, and that her own daughter, Gloria's actual mother, was a careless, godless, dangerous woman who did not deserve to keep her. A grandmother and a nurse, bound together over a crib, slowly deciding between them that the mother was the enemy. You can see the trap closing already, and not one of them could. They thought they were protecting a little girl. What they were building, without ever meaning to, was the case that would tear her in half. So that was the world at the bottom of the house. A devoted nurse who never left, a grandmother whose love had a hard edge to it, a dead father upstairs, and a mother we haven't really met yet, who is, at this very moment, in another country entirely, being young and beautiful and free in a way the 1920s positively invented. We should go and find her. She's easy to spot. She'll be the most glamorous woman in the room, and the loneliest child in this story will be the last thing on her mind. The lamp gets carried to the next room. To understand the mother, you have to understand that she was, in a way, a child playing a grown woman's part, and that nobody had ever really asked her whether she wanted the part at all. Gloria Morgan, she was born, one of a striking set of sisters. And here is that tangle of ages I promised you. Her mother, Laura, the same iron grandmother we just met, had for years told the world that her twin daughters were born in 1905. The twins themselves came to believe it, except the records seemed to say 1904. A single year, shaved off and forgotten, so that when Reggie died, the young widow honestly thought she was 20 when she may well have been 21. It sounds like nothing. It was not nothing. That one missing year is part of why the court decided she was too young and too foolish to be trusted with her own daughter, and part of why she never quite trusted her own mother again. The records disagree here, and honestly, both versions tell you something true. Some families lie about small things until the small things grow teeth. Gloria Morgan and her twin sister, Thelma, were the kind of beautiful that stopped conversations. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, poured into the silk of the age, they moved through 1920s Europe like two candles carried through a dim room. Paris, London, Biarritz, down on the French coast, which you say a bit like Biarritz. Cannes, Monte Carlo, the whole glittering circuit of places where rich people went to be seen, not working. Gloria crossed the Atlantic, at the height of it, as often as once a month, which in an age of ocean liners is a genuinely absurd amount of traveling, like commuting between continents. She had the allowance, remember, $4,000 a month, drawn on her baby daughter's trust. It paid for the staterooms and the gowns and the hotels, and it followed her everywhere but home. Her twin, Thelma, had done rather well for herself in the romance department, if by well you mean complicated. Thelma had become the mistress of the Prince of Wales, the actual heir to the British throne, the man who would briefly be King Edward VIII. Their affair ran for something like 5 years, and it made Gloria Morgan's little circle just about the most fashionable and most whispered about set in Europe. There's a detail here that history loves, and I'll give it to you, because it's delicious and it's true. It was Thelma who, one careless day, introduced the prince to a friend of hers, an American divorcee named Wallace Simpson. You may know how that ends. The prince fell for Wallace, gave up the throne of England to marry her, and poor Thelma got shown the door by the very woman she'd brought to dinner. But that's a different bedtime story for a different night. Tonight it only matters as the water little Gloria's mother was swimming in. Kings and princes and abdications, glamour stacked on glamour, and somewhere back across the ocean, a small girl writing postcards to a grandmother, wondering when her mother was coming home. There was a third sister too, Consuelo, who you say Consuelo, and the three of them together were a force, loyal to each other in the way that only siblings raised in a slightly unreliable house ever are. I want to be fair to Gloria Morgan here, because the tabloids were not, and the court was not, and it would be the easiest thing in the world for me to hand you a villain and let you sleep on a tidy little verdict. But she wasn't a villain. She was a very young woman who had been married off to a charming wreck of a man twice her age, widowed before she was of age herself, and handed a fortune she didn't control and a baby she'd barely been taught to hold. Nobody had mothered her especially well, and so she did what unmothered people so often do. She went looking, in ballrooms and staterooms and other people's houses, for the warmth nobody had given her first. It's not admirable. It's terribly human. And the person who paid for it, of course, was the one who'd had no say in any of it. The afternoon exhales, and we go back to the child. The twin sister deserves her own moment here, because Thelma's life was running a strange parallel to Gloria's in those very same months. And the two of them were bound together the way only twins raised in an uncertain house ever are. Thelma had done what the Morgan girls were bred to do, and done it spectacularly. After an early marriage that didn't hold, she married an English shipping lord and became Lady Furness, a viscountess, with all the country houses and titles that came with it. And then she caught the eye of the most eligible man on earth, Edward, the Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne. And for something like 5 years she was his companion, the woman on his arm, the closest thing he had to a settled love. 2 American sisters from a diplomat's shabby genteel household, and one of them was as good as queen-in-waiting. You can see why the newspapers could never get enough of the magical Morgans. But 1934 was a cruel year for both twins at once, and that's the part that stays with me. While Gloria was being torn apart in a New York courtroom, Thelma made a trip across the ocean, Partly, the story goes, to stand beside her sister in her hour of need. And before she sailed, she asked a trusted friend, an American woman she knew well, to look after the prince while she was away, to keep him company, to make sure he wasn't lonely. The friend's name was Wallace Simpson. You know the rest, or you can feel it coming. By the time Thelma came home, the prince's heart had moved, quietly and completely, from one American woman to another. Wallace would not give him back, and within 2 years that same infatuation would push a king right off his throne, in the greatest royal scandal of the century. Thelma had handed away the crown of England by asking a friend for a favor. So picture the two sisters at the end of that year. One had lost her daughter to a judge, the other had lost a future king to a friend. Both of them undone, in the same 12 months, by the very glamour they'd been raised to chase. They had each other, at least, the twins. When everything else fell away, the Morgan sisters closed ranks and held on, which is maybe the one warm thing their hard upbringing had actually given them. And the afternoon exhales. The light changes first, before anything else does. That's how it works with children who are waiting. Little Gloria spent long stretches of her early childhood in Europe with her mother, or rather, near her mother, which is not the same thing. She and Dodo would be installed in a hotel or a rented house in Paris or London, and the mother would come and go, mostly go, and the child learned the exact sound of a household that has been left. There is a hush that falls on rooms when the person everyone is arranged around has stepped out for the evening, or the week, or the season. Little Gloria knew that hush the way you know a song, and so she did the only thing a small person can do when the ocean is too wide to cross. She wrote, "The postcards survive. That's the thing that undoes me a little, if I'm honest. We have them. Small cards, a child's careful looping hand, sent across water to her grandmother Laura. And they say things a 10-year-old should never have reason to say. My mother is so bad to me," one of them reads. "I wish I could run away to New York to you." Another, plainer and somehow worse. "We are moving again. Oh, what a life. Oh, what a life." From a child who had not yet finished losing her baby teeth. Keep those postcards in your mind tonight, would you? Because we're going to come back to them. They're the smallest object in this whole enormous story, a few pennies of card and ink, and they'll end up telling the truth that all the lawyers and all the money never quite could. A child does not write, "Oh, what a life," unless someone, somewhere, has taught her the words for tired. Now, the grandmother reading those postcards was not a neutral party. Laura Morgan received each one like fresh evidence in a case she was already prosecuting in her own heart. Every unhappy line from the child confirmed what Laura had decided long ago, that her daughter was unfit and the child was suffering, and something would have to be done. And here is the quiet tragedy of it, the thing I want you to hold gently rather than hold against anyone. Laura wasn't wrong that the child was lonely. She was only wrong about what to do with that being true. Because the something that got done, in the end, was to take a lonely little girl and set her at the center of the most public, most brutal, most photographed family fight of the decade. If you have ever watched relatives go to war over a child, each of them certain they're the one who loves her most, you know that the child's actual happiness has a way of becoming the first thing everyone forgets. The mending basket can wait until tomorrow. Before we go a step further, I owe you the mother's own beginning, because you cannot really judge Gloria Morgan without knowing the house that made her, and it turns out she was raised to be exactly the kind of woman the court would one day punish her for being. She came from a set of sisters the newspapers liked to call the magical Morgans. Their father was an American named Harry Hayes Morgan, a diplomat, a consul who was posted from country to country in the service of the United States, which meant the children grew up nowhere and everywhere at once. Gloria herself was born in Switzerland, in the town of Lucerne, which is why the papers always called her Swiss-born, though she was as American as the flag over her father's consulate. The family drifted from posting to posting across Europe and beyond, genteel and glamorous, and, underneath the good manners, not remotely rich. That's the piece that unlocks her, I think. The Morgan sisters were raised in what you might kindly call elegant poverty. Beautiful clothes on credit, the right addresses without the money to truly own them. A life that looked like wealth from across a ballroom and felt like anxiety up close. And their mother, the same Laura we've met, taught her daughters the one lesson she believed a beautiful girl needed. Marry well, marry money. Beauty was the family's only real capital, and it had a shelf life, and a wise girl spent it on a rich husband before it faded. So, the sisters were sent out into the grand rooms of Europe, like ships loaded with the family's only cargo. Consuelo married, Thelma married, and married again, straight into a title, and Gloria, at just 18, married the most spectacular catch of all, a real Vanderbilt, Reggie, with his famous name and his fortune and his 45 years to her 18. She did exactly what she'd been raised from the cradle to do. And a decade later, she'd stand in a courtroom, while the world called her grasping and cold for having wanted the money, as though anyone had ever taught her to want anything else. The mending basket can wait, and that brings us, painfully, to Laura herself, the grandmother, because the deepest wound in this whole story isn't between the aunt and the mother at all. It's between the mother and her own mother. Picture it. Laura Kilpatrick Morgan had spent her daughters like currency, pushed them toward rich men, and then watched, with mounting horror, as the daughter who'd landed the biggest prize used her widow's freedom to live exactly the loose, glittering, pleasure-seeking life that all that money made possible. Whether Laura was disgusted, or frightened, or simply could not forgive Gloria for enjoying a liberty Laura herself had never tasted, we can't fully know. What we know is what she did. She took the side of the aunt. She stood up in the machinery of the law and swore that her own daughter was not fit to raise the child. A mother testifying to break her daughter. There are betrayals that a family never quite recovers from, and this was one, and little Gloria was the ground it happened on. You can almost feel sorry for all three of them at once. The grandmother, the mother, and the child. 3 generations of women who'd been taught that love and money were the same thing, discovering in the cruelest possible way that they were not. And nobody argues with the quiet. When the wind shifts in this story, it comes in the shape of a man. There was, for a stretch of those European years, a prince hanging about the edges of Gloria Morgan's life. And I use the word prince loosely, the way the 1920s used it, to mean a man with a title and a coat of arms, and quite often, no money whatsoever to hang either on. His name was Gottfried, of the House of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, and I'm going to say that name slowly once so it doesn't trip you in the dark. Gottfried, Hohenlohe-Langenburg. There. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria herself, which sounds tremendously grand until you learn that Victoria had so many descendants scattered across so many minor German courts that being one of them by the 1920s was a bit like owning shares in a company that had stopped paying out. Gottfried had the blood and the bearing and not much else. What he wanted was to marry Gloria Morgan. What stood in his way was a baby's trust fund and a very unromantic judge. Because here's the wall he ran into. Surrogate Judge Foley, the same careful man watching over little Gloria's money, had laid down a rule as plain as a locked door. No part of the child's income, he said, could be used to finance her mother's second marriage. In other words, if Gloria Morgan wanted to marry her penniless prince, she'd have to do it on her own dime, and she didn't especially have one. The whole shimmering life, the crossings and the gowns, ran on the child's money, and the child's money came with strings, and the strings said no. So, the marriage never happened, and little Gloria, who understood none of the legal machinery, but understood the man perfectly well, simply feared him. She hated him, quietly, the way children hate the adult who has taken their mother's attention and given them nothing back. He never spoke to her, not unkindly, just entirely, as though she were a piece of the furniture that happened to travel with the luggage. Picture being 6 years old and sharing a rented house with a silent prince who looks straight through you. You'd want your grandmother too. You'd write the postcard as well. I linger on Gottfried for a moment, because his silent presence in those rooms is going to matter enormously later, in a courtroom, when a devoted nurse takes the stand and describes exactly what she says she saw through certain doorways. For now, just file him away. The penniless prince, the mother in love, the judge saying no, and the child in the corner, watching a man who wouldn't look at her. That's the last of Europe. The tide's about to turn and carry the whole story back across the ocean, to America, to a summer that seemed, at the time, like the kindest thing anyone had done for little Gloria in years. It wasn't unkind. That's what makes it so sad. It was a genuinely nice idea that turned into a war. And the clock ticks on, alone. While the grown-ups were being glamorous and unreliable across the ocean, the actual shape of little Gloria's days, the small, warm architecture of them, was built almost entirely by Dodo, and it's worth lingering on because it's the one genuinely cozy corner of this whole story. A child raised by a devoted nurse in those years, lived by a rhythm as steady as a clock, and steadiness, for a child whose mother came and went like weather, was its own kind of love. There was a waking hour, the same one every day. There was breakfast that arrived without fail, warm and plain. There was the ritual of being dressed, the same careful hands doing up the same small buttons, smoothing the same pinafore, brushing and ribboning the hair. There were walks, in whichever park or garden the current city offered, a small gloved hand in a larger one. There was the nap that a child fights and then sinks into. There was, at the close of the day, the bath and the warmed nightgown, and the particular hush of a nursery at bedtime. The lamp turned low, a story read in a voice the child knew better than any other in the world. And there was Dodo, near the bed, the last face at night and the first in the morning, for years without a single missed day. You know, better than any lawyer ever argued it, what that steadiness does for a small person. It tells them the world is safe, that someone is minding it, that they can let go and sleep because a warm, reliable somebody is keeping watch. Little Gloria got precious little of that from the people whose job it supposedly was. She got all of it from a hired nurse who simply decided, quietly, that this child would be loved on time, every day, no matter who else forgot. It was the best thing anyone ever gave her, and it was given in warm milk and clean ribbons, and a low lamp, and it asked for nothing back. And the lamps are turned down, one by one. The trouble when it finally came, arrived disguised as a sore throat. In the early summer of 1932, little Gloria, now 8 years old, needed her tonsils out. Nothing exotic. Half the children of that era had it done, on a kitchen table's worth of ether and a promise of ice cream after. She was brought back to New York for the operation, and her mother, who had a ship to catch and a life to get back to in Europe, welcomed a suggestion that must have sounded, in the moment, like simple good sense. Why not let the child recover over the summer out on Long Island, in all that fresh air, at the home of her aunt? The aunt in question was Reggie's sister. Her name was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and to understand what happened next, you need to understand that Gertrude was not some spare relative with a big lawn. Gertrude was a power in her own right. Gertrude was a sculptor, a serious one, with calloused hands and a studio and real work in real bronze, which for a woman of her class and her decade was close to scandalous all on its own. She had the Vanderbilt fortune on one side and her husband Harry Payne Whitney's fortune on the other, two of the largest piles of money in America married into one household, and she spent hers on art the way her brother Reggie had spent his on horses, except that Gertrude's spending built something that's still standing. She founded a museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, in New York, which you can walk into to this day. So when this woman offered to let a recovering 8-year-old spend the summer at her estate in Old Westbury, out among the hedges and the horses of Long Island's Gold Coast, it was a generous offer from a formidable woman, and Gloria Morgan took it and sailed for Europe and did not think very hard about it. Why would she? It was a summer. Children have summers. Except the summer didn't end. Come the fall, the Whitney family doctor suggested the child ought to stay on a while longer. The country air, her health, all very reasonable. Her mother, still abroad, agreed again, and somewhere in that second easy yes, without a single dramatic moment, without anyone deciding anything out loud, little Gloria stopped being a guest at her aunt's house and started being a resident. She had a room there now. She had a routine. Dodo was with her, thank heaven, so the child had her anchor. But the ground had shifted under everyone's feet, and the person who felt it first, sharp and cold, was a mother across an ocean who suddenly did the arithmetic and realized her daughter was living in another woman's house. And you know how it is with a door you didn't notice closing. You only hear the click much later, from the other room, when you go to walk back through it and find it won't open. The lamp burns low, and Long Island goes to sleep. Now, money. I promised you only one room in this whole story where I ask you to follow the money closely, and this is it. So if you feel yourself drifting here, drift, because the human part comes right back and the numbers won't be on the test. Here's what happened, and it happened on paper before it ever happened in a courtroom. Judge Foley, still minding little Gloria's trust from his desk in New York, got word from Gertrude Whitney that her late brother's daughter was now living out at Old Westbury. Foley did the sensible bureaucratic thing. If the child was being housed and fed and raised at the Whitney estate, then the child's mother no longer needed a full household allowance to do the housing and feeding and raising. So he cut it. He took the allowance from about $48,000 a year down to $9,000. Picture the pen moving. One stroke, and a woman's whole way of life is crossed out. Sit with what that did. Gloria Morgan had built an entire existence. The crossings, the hotels, the gowns, the prints, on the river of money that flowed through her daughter. The moment the daughter moved out, the river moved with her. And the mother, doing that cold arithmetic at her writing desk, understood something that no one likes to say plainly about themselves. Without her child, she was nearly broke. The daughter wasn't only a daughter. The daughter was the allowance. I don't say that to make the mother a monster. I say it because it's the engine under this entire tragedy. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. A little girl had become, in the eyes of the grown-ups arranged around her, a sum of money that happened to have a face, and when two households both need the money, and both, in their own tangled way, love the face, you don't get a custody arrangement. You get a war. The mother reached for a lawyer, and she reached well. Through a companion of hers, a movie theater magnate named A.C. Blumenthal, she was introduced to one of the sharpest attorneys in New York, a man named Nathan Birkin. And Birkin, going through the papers, found something almost unbelievable. In all the years since Reggie died, in all the shuffling of trusts and allowances and surrogates, no one had ever formally made Gloria Morgan the legal guardian of her own child. She was the mother. She simply had never been named the guardian, because she'd been a minor herself when it might have happened, and then nobody got around to it. So Birkin petitioned the court to fix that, to name her sole guardian at last, which would have quietly settled everything in the mother's favor. It should have been a formality. It would have been, except that a complaint arrived to block it, and the name on the complaint stopped the room cold. It was Laura Morgan, the grandmother. The mother's own mother, standing up inside the workings of the law to declare that her daughter was unfit to raise her child. When your own mother files the paper against you, you are, I think, about as alone as a person can be. And that, for a while, is that. For a little while, the grown-ups nearly behaved. The lawyers and the surrogate hammered out a truce, the kind of reasonable arrangement that could have let a child grow up in relative peace. Little Gloria would live with Aunt Gertrude during the school year, out in the Long Island quiet, and her mother could come and see her whenever she liked. Reasonable, humane even. And it lasted right up until the moment a mother's pride collided with a mother's fear, which is to say, it lasted about as long as a soap bubble in a draft. That September, little Gloria came into the city to spend time with her mother, and at the end of the visit, Gloria Morgan looked at the arrangement she'd agreed to and simply refused it. "Little Gloria," she announced, "is not going back to Mrs. Whitney's." And with those few words, the truce was over and the real fight began. What happened the next morning reads like a scene staged for the screen, except that it was real, and there was a frightened 9-year-old in the middle of it. Picture the Whitney mansion. In one room, 3 glamorous women, Aunt Gertrude, the mother Gloria, and Aunt Consuelo, sitting with small glasses of sherry, being terribly civilized at one another, while the whole future of a child hung unspoken in the air between them. And in another part of the house, quietly, quickly, that same child was being walked out a side door to a waiting car by 2 people, Dodo the nurse and one of Gertrude Whitney's own maids. By the time the mother thought to ask where her daughter had got to, it was done. Gertrude set down her sherry and said the sentence that started the trial of the century. "Little Gloria," she said, "is halfway to Westbury by now. I'm not going to let you have her." You can almost hear the glass being put down. And that afternoon, out at Old Westbury, the law caught up with all of them. Gertrude Whitney was handed court papers, a writ of habeas corpus, and I'll translate that dusty Latin because it lands harder in plain words. A habeas corpus is a command from a court to produce a person, to bring a body before a judge and justify why you're holding it. The papers ordered Gertrude to bring the body of Gloria Laura Morgan Vanderbilt, a phrase that makes your skin prickle when the body in question is a little girl, before a judge named John Francis Carew, who you say Carew. Out at the estate, guards were posted through the house now. A guard or a maid stayed always at the child's side. Little Gloria, 9 years old, was living in a beautiful mansion full of watchers, and every one of them said they were watching for her sake. That's how the trial of the century began. Not with a gavel, with a child walked out a side door while the grown-ups drank their sherry. The house settles into its own long silence. Before the courtroom, there were the waiting weeks, and I think they may have been the strangest of little Gloria's whole strange childhood. So let me set you down inside them for a moment. After the sherry and the car and the writ, the child was back out at Old Westbury, and the great house had turned into something closer to a fortress. There were guards now, actual men posted about the place, because each side genuinely feared the other might simply take the girl and vanish. The nurse or the maid stayed at her side every waking hour and slept near her at night. Doors that had stood open were watched. A 9-year-old moving through her days with a grown man never quite out of sight, because she had become, to the adults around her, a thing that might be stolen. Imagine being small and living like that. You are the most important object in the house, and you are watched like the silver, and not one bit of it has anything to do with what you want. You are shuttled, under guard, from the aunt's world to the mother's world and back, each side certain it's rescuing you from the other, each hand over a small, cold drama of lawyers and detectives and whispered arrangements. And somewhere under all that machinery is just a child who would have traded the whole estate for one ordinary afternoon where nobody was fighting and somebody's whole attention was simply, warmly, hers. It's a frightening way to live, and I won't dwell in the fear, because we're bound for sleep and not for worry. And I'll only say that by the time the trial actually opened, little Gloria had already been living for weeks as the prize in a war. And a child can carry that kind of watching in her body for a very long time after. But that autumn is long over now. The guards went home decades ago, and the water goes still again. On the 1st of October 1934, the doors opened on what the newspapers had already, breathlessly, decided to call the trial of the century. And you have to set it in its moment to feel why it caught fire the way it did. This was the pit of the Great Depression. 1 in 4 American men was out of work. There were breadlines around the block in the same city where this trial was held. Families losing farms, men selling apples on corners in good coats gone shiny at the elbow. And into all that grinding, gray hardship dropped a story with everything. Fabulous wealth, a beautiful widow, a dead playboy, princes and countesses, and a fortune as large as a small nation. All of it being fought over in open court. More than 100 reporters packed the room. Spectators lined up before dawn for a seat. It was, for 2 solid months, the show the whole hungry country couldn't stop watching. And I understand the appeal. I do. When your own life has gone hard and thin, there is a real and slightly guilty comfort in watching the rich prove that money buys them exactly none of the things that matter. You know that feeling. Everyone does. It's why we slow down for the wreck. But underneath the spectacle, in the middle of that crowded room, there was a real child. That's the part the crowd kept forgetting, and the part I'd like us to keep remembering as we go in. Little Gloria was 10 years old now, her birthday having come and gone in the thick of all this. 10. Old enough to read the newspapers that were being written about her. Old enough to understand that 100 strangers with notebooks were sitting in a room deciding, out loud, whether her mother was a decent woman. Imagine being 10 and knowing that the worst, most whispered things about your own mother were being printed in every paper in America, with your name in the headline. That was the childhood the grown-ups had built for her, each of them certain they were saving her from the others. The judge, John Francis Carew, was a serious and rather old-fashioned man, and he would say later that he walked into that courtroom believing he had heard just about everything a courtroom could throw at him. He had not. Almost nobody had. And by the afternoon of the day, the testimony really began. The whole tone of the thing had curdled from a society scandal into something meaner. Because the first witness, who could really do damage, was the person who knew the household best. She was small and plain and fiercely certain, and the child in the room loved her more than anyone alive. It was Dodo, and that's a doorway we'll step through gently. Let me set the scene of it properly, the way it looked and felt, because a courtroom in 1934 was a very particular kind of theater. Picture New York City that autumn, the leaves going gold and brown in the parks, the air turning sharp, overcoats coming out of closets, and the whole gray weight of the Depression sitting over everything. And down at the courthouse, a crowd, not a handful of curious souls, but a genuine mob, lining up in the cold hours before the doors even opened, wanting one of the too few seats inside. Reporters by the hundred, more than 100, with their notebooks and their soft hats and their deadlines. Newsreel men with their big cameras cranking away on the steps, so the whole country could watch flickering scraps of it at the movie house that week. Before the feature, flashbulbs going off in white bursts, again and again, that sharp chemical pop and the little cloud of smoke after. And into all of that, on the mornings she was needed, came the smallest figure in the whole enormous production. A girl of 10 in a good coat, hand-held, hurried up the steps through the crush of shouting adults, cameras firing in her face, strangers straining to get a look at the poor little rich girl in the flesh. Whatever else you take from tonight, hold that picture for a second. A child, that age, walking a gauntlet of flashbulbs to go sit in a room where grown men in dark suits would spend the day arguing about whether her mother was a decent human being. No child should have to walk that walk. She walked it more than once, and she was, by every account, composed about it, quiet, careful, already expert at the particular stillness that children learn when the adults around them cannot be relied upon. The house lights go down. The show begins, and the candle gutters and gives up. I've made the trial sound almost swift, and I should slow down and let you feel how long it truly went, because the grinding length of it was part of the cruelty. This was not a single dramatic afternoon. It ran for the better part of 2 months, day after day after day. A slow machine chewing through one witness at a time. And what a parade of witnesses. Both sides had money, and money in a courtroom buys you an army, so each side marched in its own regiment of servants to testify about the other. Maids and nurses and drivers and cooks, the people who see everything from the edges of a rich family's life, called one after another to stand up and tell a room full of reporters what they'd glimpsed through half-open doors. Downstairs, staff deciding the fate of the family upstairs. There's a grim justice in it, and a grim sadness too, because the servants had their own loyalties and their own grudges and their own jobs to protect, and the truth got pulled in a dozen directions at once. And in the middle of it sat Judge Carew, who had, I truly believe, one of the worst jobs in America that autumn. Think about the box he was in. On one side, a mother, and the oldest, simplest principle in the world, that a child belongs with her mother. On the other, a mountain of testimony, some of it surely exaggerated, painting that mother as unfit. And no clean answer anywhere, because the honest truth was that the child was not thriving with anyone, and every adult in the room loved her a little and used her a lot. He had to decide, in public, with the whole country reading over his shoulder, what to do with one small girl whose own words kept changing depending on which house she'd slept in last. Whatever you think of the ruling he finally reached, and plenty of people hated it, I can't help feeling for the man. He was handed an impossible sum and told to make it come out even, knowing it never would. Some nights there's no right answer, only the least wrong one, and you carry it home and it keeps you up. The fire takes over the conversation. The nurse took the stand against the mother, and I want to be careful and fair here, because this is the exact hinge of the whole tragedy, and it deserves more than a headline. Dodo had spent 10 years, day and night, inside Gloria Morgan's homes. She had seen everything a live-in nurse sees, which is to say, she had seen the private machinery of a life that looked so polished from the outside. And on the stand, under oath, she laid it out in the harshest terms the court had heard. She described her employer, by the account of a reporter for the New York Daily News, as a lazy, loose, erotic woman, a mother who was indifferent to rats and vermin that she said swarmed in the house, and who was, in Dodo's telling, cold and careless with her own child. The testimony ran for something like 5 hours. That same reporter wrote that it was a blistering tale no skin lotion could soothe, which is the kind of line that only the tabloids of the 1930s could write. And I hand it to you exactly because it tells you the temperature of the room. Now, was every word of it fair? That's the ache of it. Almost certainly not. Dodo loved the child with the fierce, possessive, unreasonable love of a woman who had raised someone else's baby as her own for 10 years. And that kind of love does not make an even-handed witness. She truly believed the mother was a danger. She may also, if we're honest, have believed on some level that if the mother was found unfit, the child, her child, might stay in the world where Dodo still mattered. Both things can be true at once. A person can be telling the truth as they see it and still be shaped by their own aching heart. There was other testimony too, colder and more clinical. A chauffeur who spoke about the mother's several lovers, the sort of thing a driver sees from the front seat and remembers. Piece by piece, the picture the court was being handed was of a woman who lived for herself. Some of it was likely true. Some of it was likely a loving nurse's fear wearing the costume of fact. And every word of it was being printed, that same night, for a 10-year-old to read. But that's still the tame part of the day. The judge thought he'd heard the worst of it. He was about to close the doors. And that is enough, for now. The thing that finally slammed the courtroom doors shut came from a French maid. She had worked for Gloria Morgan, and she was asked, in the plain, cruel way of cross-examination, whether she had ever seen her employer behave improperly. And she said yes. What she described, the papers preserved almost word for word, because a stenographer caught it before the judge could stop the room. The maid said that on one occasion, Mrs. Vanderbilt was in bed, reading, and that another woman was there beside the bed. That woman was Lady Milford Haven, a titled Englishwoman, related by marriage to royalty, and the maid said in her account that Lady Milford Haven had her arm around Mrs. Vanderbilt's neck and was kissing her, in the maid's own words, just like a lover. For one held breath, The courtroom went perfectly silent, and then it came apart. This was 1934, remember, when the mere suggestion of what that testimony implied was, to that public, a bomb going off. Judge Carew, the man who thought he'd heard everything, took one look at what was about to happen to his courtroom and cleared it. Out went the 100 reporters. Out went the spectators. From that point forward, he ruled. The case would be heard in private, behind closed doors, with only the parties themselves allowed to remain. But it was far too late to close a door on a thing already loose in the street. The most sensational tabloids screamed the ugliest version of it in letters 4 inches tall. The more careful papers reached for careful phrases, an alleged erotic interest, that sort of thing, dancing around a word they didn't dare print. And the country, which had been merely fascinated, was now positively inflamed. I want to slow us right down here, because this is the darkest bend in the road, and I don't want to race you through it. Here is what was actually happening, underneath the screaming headlines. A woman's most private life, true or untrue, exaggerated or not, was being pried open in public and turned into the entertainment of a nation. And whatever the truth of Gloria Morgan's heart was, and we genuinely do not know it, and it was frankly nobody's business then, and it's nobody's business now, the cruelest fact of it is simple. She had a daughter, a 10-year-old daughter who could read, and that little girl now lived in a country where every newsstand she passed might carry the worst possible word about her own mother, printed for strangers to chew over on the train. There is no version of this where the child comes out unhurt. That's the weight of it, and I've named it, and now, gently, I'll set it back down, because we honor a sad thing best by not wallowing in it. The doors were closed, the papers raged for a day, and the case, mercifully, went quiet behind those doors. Let the noise die down. Out on the courthouse steps, meanwhile, something almost tender was happening, and it tells you how confused the whole country had become about who to root for. Women had gathered, ordinary women, holding up hand-lettered placards, insisting on a mother's sacred right to her own child. They didn't know the private details. They only knew that somewhere inside that building, a mother was fighting to keep her little girl. And to them, that was a cause as old as the world, and they stood in the cold for it. It's a strange and moving picture, isn't it? All those women outside, certain of a simple truth: a mother belongs with her child, while inside, the actual story had grown so tangled that not even the judge could find the simple truth in it anymore. Both things were real: the clean principle out on the steps, and the terrible mess behind the doors. Sometimes there's no arranging them into a tidy shape. Sometimes you just hold them both and let the afternoon go quiet. Nor did Aunt Gertrude escape the mud, and there's a bleak little comedy in how they came for her. Gertrude Whitney was, remember, a serious sculptor, a woman who worked in the nude figure the way every serious sculptor since the Greeks has done. And so the other side went digging for a way to make that ordinary artistic fact sound sinister, to suggest that a woman so comfortable with the naked human form in bronze might be some improper influence on an impressionable niece. It was a stretch, and it mostly didn't stick, but it tells you how low the whole business had sunk, that a woman's life's work in art could be waved around a courtroom as evidence of moral rot. Everyone in the story was being reduced to their worst rumored self: the glamorous mother, the artist aunt, the devoted nurse, all of them flattened into tabloid cartoons, and the only one who came out of it as a whole, real, sympathetic person, the only one the whole country agreed to pity rather than judge, was the child who'd never asked to be in the room at all. The poor little rich girl. And that, for an hour, is that. After more than 5 weeks of all this, the shouting and the testimony and the headlines, Judge Carew did something quiet and, I think, decent. He decided he needed to hear from the one person everyone claimed to be speaking for and had somehow never actually asked. He cleared out the lawyers and the crowd, and he took little Gloria, along with the 2 chief attorneys and a court stenographer, into the private calm of his chambers. And there, for about 2.5 hours, he simply talked to her. A 10-year-old girl, in a quiet room, with a kind older man asking her the only questions that ever really mattered. The stenographer wrote it all down, and some of it survives, and I'll read you a little, because there is nothing I could add that would land harder than the child's own plain words. He asked her how she would like to live with her mother, down in the country. "No," she said, "never. I always want to live with my aunt." He pressed, gently. "You lived a long while with your mother, didn't you?" "Yes," she said, "but I have hardly seen her. She has never been nice to me." And then he asked the question that a kind man asks, the hopeful one, the one that tries to leave a door open. "Don't you think," he said, "you could learn to love her?" And the little girl said no. "She never even kissed me good night. She never even kissed me good night." There it is. 10 years of an ocean between them, boiled down by a child into the smallest, truest, most devastating complaint a person can make. Not the money, not the scandal, not the lawyers. A goodnight kiss that never came. If you have ever tucked a child in, or longed to be tucked in yourself, you feel exactly how far down that one goes. And yet, I promised you at the start that I'd never hand you a fact I couldn't stand behind. And honesty means telling you that even this, even the child's own words, is not quite the simple thing it sounds. Many years later, grown and gray, and finally able to look back at it all, Gloria herself wrote about that time, and she said that she believed she had been coached, that her aunt's lawyer had worked with her beforehand, had helped her know what to say, had taught a frightened child to tell the court she was afraid of her mother. And when you set that memory beside another small fact from the trial, it gets sadder still, because the mother's own lawyers, blindsided by their client's little daughter turning against her, produced in court a stack of letters, loving letters, warm ones, in the child's hand, written to her mother not long before. So which Gloria was the real one? The one writing love to her mother, or the one telling the judge she'd never even been kissed goodnight? The records don't line up here, and honestly, both of them hold a truth. A child pulled hard enough between 2 houses will say what each house needs to hear, and mean it, and be telling the truth every time, because the deepest truth of all is that she just wanted somewhere to finally be safe, and the room sinks into shadow. There's a small pile of paper in this story that troubles me more than all the scandalous testimony put together, and it's worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet. When the child spoke against her mother, in that courtroom and in those chambers, the mother's lawyers were stunned, and they reached into their files and produced letters. Letters little Gloria had penned to her mother only weeks earlier, in her own hand, and they were warm, loving even. The ordinary sweet notes a daughter sends a mother she misses. So the room was left holding 2 versions of one small girl at the same time. The child on the witness stand, who said her mother had never once been nice to her, and the child in the letters, who signed off with love and kisses, both of them real, both of them, in their way, true. How do you square that? I don't think you fully can, and I don't think you're meant to, and I think the not squaring is the truest thing in the whole case. Because a child pulled between 2 powerful houses, watched and guarded and questioned, and, by her own later account, quietly coached on what to say, does not have the luxury of a single simple heart. She loves her mother, and she fears her. She wants to go home, and she doesn't know which house home is. She tells the kind judge what the aunt's people prepared her to tell him, and she tells her mother, in a letter, the love she genuinely feels. And she is not lying either time. She's just 10, and she's drowning, and she's reaching for whichever hand is nearest in the moment. Years later, grown, she'd write that she had been coached to say she was afraid. But underneath the coaching, there was a real, frightened, love-starved little girl who would have said almost anything to make the terrible tug-of-war stop. That's not a witness. That's a casualty. And the stairs creak once, then hush. On the 21st of November, 1934, Judge Carew handed down his decision, and it pleased almost no one, which is often the mark of a judge trying honestly to split an impossible difference. Custody of little Gloria went to her aunt, Gertrude Whitney. The child would live out at Old Westbury. But her mother was not cut off entirely. The judge ruled that Gloria Morgan could have her daughter every week from Saturday morning until Sunday evening, plus 8 hours on Christmas Day, and all of the month of July. Read that arrangement again, and you can feel the cold machinery of it. A childhood carved into visiting hours. A mother allotted her own daughter by the calendar page. One tabloid, the New York Journal-American, caught the ugliness of it in a nasty little rhyme that went around the city, a twist on the old cradle song. "Rockabye baby," it ran. "Up on a writ. Monday to Friday, mother's unfit. As the week ends, she rises in virtue. Saturdays, Sundays, mother won't hurt you." It's a cruel little verse. It's also, God help us, an accurate one. That was the shape of the deal. A mother judged unfit 5 days a week and safe on the weekends, as though love ran on a timetable. There was one more casualty of that ruling, and it's the one that breaks my heart cleanest, because it fell on the person who'd done nothing but loved the child every single day for 10 years. Judge Carew dismissed Dodo, the nurse. He decided, perhaps not wrongly, that the fierce old woman had been part of poisoning the child against her mother, that her devotion had curdled into something that stood in the way of any healing. And so, the one steady presence in little Gloria's entire life, the warm body who had come at every cry since the girl was 2 weeks old, was simply removed. Sent away. The mother lost the custody fight, yes. But the child lost Dodo, and I'm not sure the grown-ups fighting over her ever fully understood that they'd just taken away the only mother the girl had ever actually had. Her lawyers tried to appeal it, all the way up. The New York Court of Appeals declined to hear it. The Supreme Court of the United States declined to hear it. The verdict stood, and the afternoon exhaled, and a 10-year-old went to live in a big, quiet house with an aunt who, the papers would soon notice, seemed to lose all interest in her the moment the cameras went away. So little Gloria went to live, for good now, in her aunt's world, and you might imagine that being handed to the winning side of a custody war would feel like being rescued. It didn't. Here is the quiet cruelty that the newspapers, having gotten their verdict, mostly stopped reporting once the trial was over and the cameras had packed up and moved on to the next sensation. Aunt Gertrude seemed to simply lose interest in the child she had fought 2 months and spent a fortune to win. Gertrude was a busy, serious woman with a museum to run and her own grown children and a sculptor's life, and the little girl she'd taken in became, more or less, another well-kept fixture of a very large house. Cared for, certainly, clothed, fed, schooled, given everything a child could point to, and nothing a child actually needs. You can be surrounded by servants and acreage and still be the loneliest person for miles, and little Gloria was learning that lesson young. Think about what her days were actually made of. A vast house on Long Island's Gold Coast, all long corridors and rooms she wasn't meant to disturb, meals brought by staff, a schedule, riding lessons perhaps, and the right schools, and clothes that fit and toys that worked. And in the midst of it all, a 10-year-old wandering those grand halls with no one whose whole heart was pointed at her. The mother came on her allotted weekends, an awkward visitor by then, the two of them strangers trying to perform a closeness the court had scheduled but couldn't manufacture. The aunt was distant. The grandmother had rather burned herself out in the fighting, and Dodo, the one warm sun the child's whole small solar system had ever turned around, was gone, sent away by order of the court. If you have ever been a child in a house full of adults who don't quite see you, you know that particular flavor of quiet. It isn't peaceful, it's just empty, and the shutters draw the dark in. I want to step back from the little girl for a moment and tell you about the name she was carrying, because you can't really understand the weight on her small shoulders without it. Vanderbilt. In the America of that time, the name meant almost more than the word rich could hold. It went back to a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, born poor on Staten Island back in the 1790s. A rough, shrewd, barely schooled boy who started with a single small boat, ferrying passengers across New York Harbor for pennies. They called him the Commodore, later, half in mockery and half in awe. He clawed and outworked and outmaneuvered everyone around him, first in boats, then in the great ocean-going steamships, and finally in the railroads that were stitching the young country together. By the time he died, he had piled up a fortune so large that it was said to be greater than the amount of money held in the United States Treasury. One man, from one rowboat, to more than the national purse. That was the root of the tree little Gloria was hanging from. And the generations that came after the Commodore did what generations often do with a fortune they didn't sweat for. They spent it, gloriously. They built palaces up and down Fifth Avenue and vast summer cottages, though calling them cottages is a joke, in places like Newport, marble halls with gold leaf on the ceilings and staircases wide enough to drive a carriage up. They gave balls that cost more than most towns saw in a decade, and slowly, marble hall by marble hall, party by party, the Commodore's mountain of money began to melt, because it turns out that spending is a skill the poor learn and the very rich forget. By the time it reached little Gloria's father, Reggie, his share was already a shadow of the old glory, and Reggie, as we've seen, made short work of the shadow. So the little girl at the center of the trial of the century was, in a sense, the heiress to a legend that was already mostly spent. She had the famous name and the famous fortune, and both of them were far more famous than they were real. What she truly inherited was the attention, the endless, hungry, public attention. And attention, it turns out, is the one Vanderbilt possession that never ran out. And the parlor settles into dusk. And since we're on the subject of that fortune, let me tell you how the whole glittering mountain of it ended, because it's one of the quietest, strangest lessons in all of American history. And it was already most of the way finished by the time little Gloria was born. The Commodore died leaving something like $100 million, an almost unimaginable sum for the 1870s, more than enough to keep a family like royalty for centuries, if they'd only sat on it. They did not sit on it, they built. Up and down Fifth Avenue in New York, they raised a row of mansions so grand, the newspapers called it Vanderbilt Row, And up in Newport, they built those marble summer palaces. And down in North Carolina, one of them built a house called Biltmore that remains, to this day, the largest private home ever built in America. Hundreds of rooms. Its own village. Beauty stacked on beauty. And every stone of it paid for out of the Commodore's pile. And here is the quiet ending. You cannot outspend arithmetic forever. Split among more and more children in each generation, poured into houses that cost fortunes just to heat and staff. The great Vanderbilt money thinned and thinned. The Fifth Avenue palaces were sold and, one by one, knocked flat, torn down to put up office towers and shops, so that today you can walk that whole avenue and never know a Vanderbilt palace ever stood there. The story goes that some 50 years after the Commodore died, when a great crowd of his descendants gathered for a family reunion, there was not a single millionaire left among them. From the richest family in America to that, in about 3 generations. Little Gloria was born right at the tail of the fall, into a name that still rang like gold, and a bank account that was mostly echo, which is its own kind of answer, isn't it, to that hungry depression crowd reading the papers. The richest family in the world couldn't hold on to the money either. It runs through every hand eventually. The only things that last are the ones you can't put a price on, and those, the Vanderbilts learned the hard way, are exactly the things all that money never could buy. And the ship's lights fade on the horizon. The trial ended, but the watching never did. That's the part I find hardest to forgive, on little Gloria's behalf, and she wasn't even mine to be protective of. She grew from the 10-year-old of the headlines into a teenager, and you might hope the world would have the decency to let a young girl grow up in peace. It did not. The nickname had stuck like tar, the poor little rich girl. It followed her into every room, every school, every summer. Reporters and cameramen trailed her the way gulls trail a fishing boat. And everywhere she went, she carried the knowledge that strangers knew the worst chapter of her family's life and felt entitled to more. Her own son, Anderson, would put it plainly many years later. As a teenager, he said, she tried to avoid the spotlight, but reporters and cameramen followed her everywhere. She was determined to make something of her life, determined to make a name for herself, and to find the love she so desperately needed. That last phrase is the one to hold on to tonight. The love she so desperately needed. Because if you understand nothing else about the woman little Gloria became, understand that she walked out of that childhood with a hole in her exactly the shape of a mother who never came, a father she never knew, and a nurse who was taken away, and she spent a great many years of her life trying to fill it. She looked for it in the way a person looks for something they were never given a map to, which is to say, imperfectly, and in the wrong places, and again and again. She was beautiful, she was famous, she was wealthy, and she was, underneath all of it, still that girl in the big quiet house, listening for footsteps that didn't come. You and I know people shaped like that. Some of us have been people shaped like that. It isn't a flaw of character. It's a wound, doing what wounds do, which is ache toward whatever looks like healing. And the quiet comes flooding back. Her first real bid for escape came young, the way it often does for children in a hurry to be out of their own story. In 1941, when she was just 17, she went out to California to visit her mother, who was living then in Beverly Hills, and there she met and swiftly married a Hollywood agent named Pasquale Di Chico, known to everyone as Pat, which you say Di Chico, 17 years old and a bride. And you don't have to know a single unkind detail of that marriage, though there are some, to know exactly why she did it. She was reaching for a door marked out, anywhere but the Gilded Cage. Anyone who would choose her on purpose, freely, in a way nobody in that courtroom ever had. It was not a happy marriage, and it did not last. They divorced when she was 21, but you can hardly blame a girl who had been fought over like a piece of property for grabbing at the first chance to belong to herself, even if the chance turned out to be a poor one. She was learning the oldest lesson the unloved have to learn, which is that you cannot marry your way out of a hole in your own heart. You have to fill it yourself, eventually. She wasn't there yet. She was 17 and free, and that felt, for a moment, like enough. The door clicks shut behind her. There is a small, sharp irony waiting in her 21st birthday, and I can't resist handing it to you, because life so rarely rhymes this cleanly. On the day little Gloria turned 21, the fortune that had been fought over her whole childhood finally, legally, became hers. The trust unlocked. She came into something close to $5 million, the very money that two households had fought bitterly over when she was too small to spell it. And what did she do? Freshly rich and freshly divorced. Within a day, more or less, she married again. This time to a man about as far from a Hollywood agent as you could travel. His name was Leopold Stokowski, which you say Stukowski, and he was one of the most famous orchestra conductors in the entire world. He was also, and I want you to hear this number, 42 years older than she was. 42 years. She was 21. He was old enough, comfortably, to be her grandfather, and if that arrangement sounds achingly familiar, it should. Her own mother had married a charming, much older, self-destructive man at just about the same tender age. The daughter, reaching for love, reached for the very same shape of it her mother had. That's how these things travel down through a family, quietly, in the blood, in the pattern of who we run toward in the dark. And the hallway goes dark. The marriage to the old conductor lasted about 10 years, and it gave her the two things her own childhood never had, which were children of her own to love, and then, cruelly, a chance to watch her own history try to repeat itself. She and Stokowski had two sons, Stan, born in 1950, and Christopher, born 2 years after. And here is where the pattern comes all the way around and looks the grown Gloria dead in the eye. When the marriage finally fell apart in the mid-1950s, it fell apart into a custody fight. Gloria Vanderbilt, the woman, found herself in a courtroom, battling over the custody of her own children, standing in almost exactly the spot her mother had stood in 20 years before. Say that softly to yourself. The child who was fought over grew up to fight over her children, and the way it resolved is the detail that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Gloria won. She got custody of her sons, and the court granted their father, the old conductor, the right to see the boys on weekends and for a month in the summertime. Weekends, and a month in the summer. If that arrangement rings a bell in the back of your mind, it should, because it is nearly word for word the deal a judge handed down over little Gloria herself back in 1934. Her mother had gotten the weekends and the month of July. Now Gloria was the mother, holding the custody, handing out the weekends. She had traveled all the way from one side of that courtroom to the other, from the child on the writ to the parent with the ruling in her hand. I don't think there's a tidy lesson in it. I just think it's one of those places where a life folds over on itself, and you can see, for a second, the whole shape of a person's story pressed flat. She had promised herself, surely, that her children would never feel what she had felt, and she was standing in the very machine that had broken her, trying to work it more gently from the other side. The afternoon exhales. Real love, the steady kind. The kind she'd been reaching for since she was a girl listening for footsteps. Finally arrived when she'd nearly stopped expecting it. After the conductor, there was a brief marriage to the film director Sidney Lumet, a talented man, though that one didn't take either. And then, in 1963, she married a writer named Wyatt Cooper. By every account, this was the one. This was the marriage where the reaching finally stopped. Wyatt was warm and grounded and southern and kind. A man who actually saw her, the whole of her, the frightened girl and the famous woman both, and who wanted nothing from her but her company. He helped raise her 2 older boys as his own, and together they had 2 more sons, Carter and Anderson. For once in her whole life, she was simply at the center of a family that loved her plainly. No lawyers, no cameras, no ocean in between. She would say, later, that those were the happiest years. A woman in her 40s, finally getting the ordinary, warm, domestic life that most people take for granted, and she had spent 4 decades trying to find. It did not last as long as she deserved, because life is not in the business of paying out its debts on any schedule that makes sense. Wyatt Cooper died in 1978, after heart surgery, far too young, and Gloria was a widow again, this time a genuinely heartbroken one, having lost the single person who had loved her the way the little girl in the courtroom had always needed to be loved. She knew other sorrows too, deep ones, the kind a mother should never have to carry. And I'll not lay them all out tonight, because some griefs are too heavy for a bedtime story, and this is meant to send you off gently, not weigh you down. It's enough to say that she had learned, by then, more than her share about loss. She had lost a father before she could know him, a mother she never really had, a nurse who was taken from her, a husband who was the love of her life. If anyone had earned the right to fold up quietly and stop, it was her. She did the opposite. She was in her 50s, and she was about to become, for the first time, entirely her own woman. And that, I think, is the part of her story worth staying awake for, if you can. The fire settles. Here is a thing about Gloria Vanderbilt that got buried under the scandal for most of her life, and that I'd love for you to take away from tonight, because it's the good part. She was, all along, an artist. Not a dabbler, not a rich woman with a hobby and a checkbook, a real one. She painted, seriously, canvases full of color and dreamlike figures, and she showed them in actual galleries where actual critics looked at them. She wrote poetry first and then memoir after memoir, trying to set down the strange life she'd been handed. She made collages, layering paper and paint and bits of her own history into something new. The little girl who'd had no one pointing their whole heart at her had learned, somewhere in all that loneliness, to point her own heart at the blank page and the empty canvas. Creation was the one place nobody could schedule her, or fight over her, or put her on a writ. It was hers, and she poured decades into it, quietly, long before anybody thought to take her seriously. The work spread outward the way a real creative life does. Her paintings became patterns. The patterns became things you could actually live with, note cards and paper goods, then linens for the bed, then china for the table, then scarves and blouses. She was building, piece by piece, a kind of domestic world you could buy and bring home, all of it stamped with her particular dreamy eye. Picture it, the poor little rich girl, the child the whole country had pitied, quietly turning herself into the woman whose sense of beauty ended up in ordinary people's kitchens and bedrooms. There's something so satisfying about that to me. The girl who was treated like an object her whole childhood grew up to make objects, that brought other people comfort. She took the thing that had been done to her and turned it, slowly, inside out. And she was only getting started, because the biggest turn of all was still coming, and it was going to have her own name stitched right onto the back of it. That is enough, for now. In the middle of the 1970s, when she was past 50, an age when the world tends to quietly usher women toward the exit, Gloria Vanderbilt put her name on a pair of blue jeans, and everything changed. Now, jeans were work clothes. Denim was what farmers and laborers had worn for 100 years, sturdy and cheap and about as far from Fifth Avenue glamour as a fabric could get. But somebody had the idea to make them fitted and flattering and a little bit fancy, and to stitch a famous name across the back pocket. And the famous name they reached for was hers. There was a swan embroidered on them, and her signature, Gloria Vanderbilt, right there where everyone could read it. And here is the sweet, strange genius of it. The very name that had been dragged through every newspaper in America when she was 10, the name that had meant scandal and pity and other people's fortunes. She took that name and made it mean something a working woman could buy for herself and feel wonderful in. They sold like nothing anyone had seen. By the end of the 1970s, her jeans were outselling every designer rival on the racks, beating out names the fashion world took far more seriously. The numbers got enormous. In a single year, her line moved something well over $100 million in sales, and her cut of it, her royalty, ran into the millions all on its own. For the first time in her entire life, Gloria Vanderbilt was rich with money that was truly, unarguably hers. Not the Commodore's, not Reggie's melted fortune, not the trust two households had gone to war over while she watched from the corner. Money she had made, using her own name and her own eye, and her own stubborn refusal to disappear. The child who had been valued only as the key to somebody else's fortune had grown into a woman who minted her own. You'd have to have a heart of stone not to cheer for that a little. She had spent her whole childhood being told, in effect, what she was worth to other people. In her 50s, she finally got to decide it for herself. And the street goes back to sleep. We should talk about the mother, because you're probably wondering, the way I always wonder, whether the two of them ever found their way back to each other. Whether little Gloria, grown and successful, and finally her own woman, ever sat across a table from Gloria Morgan and closed the ocean that the trial had opened between them. And the honest answer, the one the record gives us, is tender and sad and not very tidy. They did not, really. The distance never fully healed. Years later, an old woman looking back, Gloria said of her mother that she had no relationship with her at all, that she had only worshipped her from afar. Those were her words. Worshipped her from afar. She said she felt no connection, and, most piercing of all, that being near her mother made her feel like an imposter. Imagine carrying that your whole life. Not hatred, which at least has heat in it, just a cold, aching, unbridgeable strangeness between a daughter and the one woman who was supposed to be home. And yet I don't want to hand you the mother as a villain, even now, at the end, because I don't believe she was one. Gloria Morgan was a girl who was married off too young, widowed too young, handed a fortune and a baby, and no earthly idea what to do with either. Mothered by a woman who would one day testify against her, and then flattened into a tabloid cartoon in front of the entire country. She made real mistakes, the kind that cost her daughter dearly. And she was also, herself, a kind of casualty of the same machine. Two Glorias, mother and daughter, each of them underloved in her own way, each of them reaching across a gap neither one had dug. If there's a thing to feel here, at the quiet end of the night, I don't think it's blame. I think it's just a soft sorrow for both of them, and maybe a little gratitude that we don't all have to live our family sorrows on the front page. The distance stayed. The daughter made her peace with it the only way she could, which was to build a warmer house for her own children than the one she'd been given. Sometimes that's the only forgiveness a person can manage, and it's more than enough, and the night keeps its own counsel. What became of the rest of them, you might ask? All those grand and glamorous people who circled the small girl at the heart of that courtroom. Well, Aunt Gertrude, the aunt who won and then forgot, died only a few years after the trial, in the early 1940s. And here is the fair thing to say about her, the thing that outlasts the cold way she treated her niece. That museum she founded, the Whitney Museum of American Art, is still open, still standing in New York, still hung with the work of American artists she believed in when nobody else would spend a dime on them. She was a difficult, distant woman to one lonely child. And she was also a genuine force who used her fortune to build something that has given ordinary people beauty for 100 years. People are rarely only one thing. Her sister-in-law's twin, Thelma, drifted out of the royal spotlight after handing her prince to Wallace Simpson and lived out a quieter life in the long shadow of the man who gave up a throne. The Iron Grandmother, Laura, faded from the story she'd done so much to set on fire. The glamorous set scattered, the way glamorous sets always do, into old age and obituaries. And Dodo, dear, fierce, plain, devoted Dodo, the nurse who came at every cry from the time the baby was 2 weeks old, and who was sent away by a judge for the crime of loving too hard and too well. I wish I could tell you the whole of what happened to her, but the record goes quiet, the way it so often does around the people who mattered most and mattered least all at once, the servants, the nurses, the ones history forgets to write down. What I can tell you is that the little girl never forgot her. How could she? When you strip away the fortune and the famous name and the trial of the century and the genes and the marriages and all the noise of a very loud life, the truest love of Gloria Vanderbilt's childhood was a nurse named Dodo, warming a bottle in the small hours, and no court order ever managed to take that from her. Not really. They can dismiss a nurse. They cannot dismiss a memory. And the story rests there a while. She lived a very long time, which feels like its own kind of justice, given how much of her early life was spent being made small. Gloria Vanderbilt kept going, kept painting, kept writing, kept falling in love with the world, right into her 90s. She wrote book after book, turning her strange life over and over in her hands, trying to understand it, sharing it rather than hiding it. Late in her life, she and her youngest son, Anderson, made something together, a long-filmed conversation and then a book in which the two of them finally said to each other all the things families so often leave unsaid until it's too late. She was in her 90s by then, and she sat with her grown son and answered every hard question he had, about the trial, about her mother, about the loves and the losses, with a startling, disarming honesty. A woman who had spent her whole girlhood being talked about, choosing at last to simply talk, openly, to the person she loved most. There's a kind of triumph in that quieter than any fortune. What comes through, in all of it, is that she never turned bitter, and Lord knows she'd earned the right to. She stayed curious. She stayed romantic, hopelessly so, falling in love with love again and again her whole life. She kept a child's openness to wonder, which is a strange thing to say about a woman whose childhood was stolen out from under her. But maybe it isn't strange at all. Maybe the part of her that never got to be a small, safe, cherished child, just refused, ever after, to grow a hard shell over the tenderness. She died in the summer of 2019, at the age of 95, with Anderson beside her, and he told the world about it gently, the way she'd have wanted, calling her simply an extraordinary woman who loved life and lived it on her own terms. 95 years, from the baby carried up the stairs while her father lay dying, to the old woman surrounded by the family she'd built herself, and every hard mile in between. She had outlived the scandal, outlived the pity, outlived nearly everyone who'd ever tried to decide what she was worth. And she got the last word, which was, more or less, that she'd loved it all anyway. Rest easy, we'll say to her later, but not quite yet, and the day folds itself quietly away. Now, I've told you what happened to the girl. Before I let you drift off entirely, let me answer the question that's maybe been sitting at the back of your mind all night, the one I'd be asking. Why? Why did an entire country, in the worst of the Great Depression, care so desperately about one small rich girl's custody? And the answer tells you as much about that America as it does about the Vanderbilts. Understand that these were the years the modern tabloid was born, hungry and cheap and everywhere. New York had newspapers locked in a circulation war so fierce they'd print almost anything to sell one more copy on one more corner. Papers like the Daily News had learned that a scandal about the rich, told in big pictures and bigger headlines, sold like bread when bread was scarce. And here, dropped into their laps, was the perfect cereal, a beautiful widow, a secret world of princes and countesses, a fortune, and at the center of it, a child you could pity without having to envy. It ran for 2 months, day after day, a real-life soap opera, and a nation with empty pockets read every word. Because here's the thing money can't hide, and the Depression made everyone hungry to see it. If you were standing in a bread line in 1934, cold and ashamed and out of work through no fault of your own, there was a bitter human comfort in opening the paper and reading that the richest family in America couldn't manage the one thing you still had, which was a child who loved you and a home, however poor, that held together. The Vanderbilts had marble staircases and a fortune the size of a nation, and they were tearing a little girl apart in open court. And you, with your patched coat and your thin soup, you tucked your own children in that night, under whatever you had, and they knew your face in the dark, and for one moment, the arithmetic of the whole cruel decade tipped, just slightly, in your favor. That's why they read it. Not really out of cruelty, out of a need to believe that the things that actually matter can't be bought, and can't be bought away from you either. The poor little rich girl let a poor and frightened country feel, for a moment, rich in the only way that counts. And the house, at last, lets out its breath. Let me take you back, just for a little while, into the world that little Gloria actually moved through as a small child, because I think the textures of it will settle nicely over you as you drift. When I say she crossed the Atlantic once a month, picture what a crossing was in those years. No airplanes to speak of. You went by ocean liner, one of the great floating cities, 5 or 6 days of open water between New York and the coast of France. There were steamer trunks the size of wardrobes, packed by maids, hauled by porters. There were staterooms with real beds, and portholes full of gray sea. There were long decks where the wind came off the water cold and salted, and rows of wooden chairs with tartan blankets, and a child could be tucked into one with a book, while the horizon rose and fell, rose and fell. It sounds romantic, and in flashes it surely was. But imagine being very small and doing it again and again, packed and unpacked, one grand strange room after another, never quite sure which country you'd wake up in, or whether your mother would be in it. We are moving again. Oh, what a life. Now you can hear the ship's engines under those words, and the houses at either end of the crossing. On the American side, there was a whole vanished world of Vanderbilt palaces, the Fifth Avenue mansions, and the enormous summer cottages up in Newport. And cottage is the family's own joke, for buildings with 40 and 50 rooms, marble imported from Italy, ballrooms under painted ceilings, gold leaf on anything that would hold it, places run by staff you'd count in the dozens, cooks and undercooks, footmen, maids for the upstairs and maids for the down, gardeners, grooms for the horses, a driver for the car. A child raised in that world was surrounded, always, by working adults, and cared for by almost none of them in the way that counts, because they were paid to keep the house running, not to love the little girl in the nursery. The nursery itself was its own small kingdom, up at the top of the house, the nurse's domain, where the real business of a child's day went on far from the grand rooms below. Warm milk and clean pinafores, and a fixed, comforting schedule. That kingdom, for little Gloria, was ruled by Dodo, and it was the one warm room in a very cold palace. You can own 50 rooms and only ever feel safe in one of them. Most of us, in our ordinary houses, feel safe in more rooms than that poor rich child did. Let that be a small comfort as you lie there. The lamp gets carried down the hall. I want to show you one more scene from after the trial, because it's the one that tells you the verdict didn't end anything, it just changed the shape of the ache. Remember the deal the judge handed down? The mother got her daughter on weekends. So every Saturday morning, little Gloria was brought in from the quiet of Long Island to her mother's rooms in the city, at a grand hotel called the Sherry-Netherland, up at the corner of the park. And you might picture a tender reunion, a mother and daughter with 2 whole days to try, clumsily, to love each other. What actually waited for that child on the sidewalk was a mob. Reporters, still, months later, hungry for one more photograph of the poor little rich girl. Detectives hired to guard her. Curiosity seekers who'd simply come to gawk, the way people gather at the scene of an accident. A little girl of 10, delivered each Saturday into a crush of shouting strangers and popping flashbulbs, just to spend a scheduled weekend with a mother she barely knew, in a hotel suite under guard. That was the prize everyone had fought for. That was custody, 2 days a week of flashbulbs and awkward silence. If you have ever felt like a visitor in your own family, you know the particular chill of that hotel suite, and the street, at last, goes quiet. The story refused to die too, which is its own strange fate. Little Gloria grew up and built her fortune and her family, but the trial of the century would not let her go. Decades later, in the 1980s, a writer named Barbara Goldsmith published a thick, best-selling book about the whole affair, and gave it a title that has haunted me since I first read it. Little Gloria, Happy at Last. That last, happy at last, aching with everything it doesn't say. The book became a television film, with a grand actress playing the formidable Aunt Gertrude, and a whole new generation met the poor little rich girl all over again, this time as prestige entertainment. Think how that must have felt, to be a grown woman with children of your own, and to watch your worst childhood paraded across the screen for strangers Sunday evenings. But here's what she did with it, and it's the same thing she'd done with the name on the blue jeans. She took the story back. She wrote her own books. told her own version, sat down with her own son, and spoke plainly into a camera, so that the last word on the poor little rich girl would be hers and not the tabloids. They had made her a character in a story for 60 years. In the end, she picked up the pen and became the author, and the whole floor goes still. There's a question that a modern listener can't help asking, lying here in a gentler century, and it's worth a quiet moment before we turn toward sleep. How did a mother lose her own child at all? Because in that era, believe it or not, the law leaned hard the other way. The common wisdom of the courts in those years was that a young child belonged with its mother, almost automatically, unless something was truly, gravely wrong. They even had a tender phrase for it, the tender years. The idea that in the early part of childhood, a mother's care was simply presumed to be best. So for the aunt to win, for a mother to actually be stripped of her little girl, it was not enough to show that Gloria Morgan was flighty, or absent, or fond of a good time. She had to be painted as something close to a moral catastrophe, and that is exactly why the attack on her was so total, so merciless, so reaching. The scandalous testimony, the erotic whispers, the vermin, the neglect, all of it was aimed at one narrow target, at clearing the very high bar the law had set. They didn't have to prove she was an ordinary, imperfect mother. They had to prove she was a monster. And in 1934, a whisper about a woman's private loves was enough to build the monster out of. Sit with how much the world has turned since then. A great deal of what was hurled at Gloria Morgan in that courtroom, and treated as proof of her ruin, would hardly raise an eyebrow in a custody case today, and certainly wouldn't cost a mother her child, who a grown woman loved, what she read in her own bed, how she spent her own evenings. We've mostly agreed, as a society, that these are nobody's weapon to swing. But she didn't have the shelter of that agreement. She stood in an earlier, harder light, where a woman's reputation was a glass thing, and once it shattered in public, it could not be swept back together, and the pieces could be used to cut away everything else she had, including her daughter. I'm not asking you to decide she was a good mother. I don't know that she was. I'm only asking you to notice that she was judged by a code that judged women, especially, with a particular cruelty, and that the same testimony today might have ended in a very different ruling. History isn't only kings and battles. Sometimes it's the slow, quiet widening of what will allow a woman to be. And that widening came too late for the Glorias, and the big house holds its breath. There's one more person I want you to meet before I put you to sleep, and he's the happy ending, or as close to one as this story gets. Little Gloria's youngest son, the boy she had with Wyatt Cooper, grew up to be a man a great many of you would recognize. His name is Anderson, and he became one of the most familiar journalists in America, a calm, curious voice on the news for decades. And the relationship between that mother and that son was, by every account, everything her own childhood had not been. Close, warm, daily. They spoke all the time. She was not a distant figure he worshipped from afar. She was simply his mother, present and loving, and endlessly interested in him, right to the end of her long life. The girl who never got a goodnight kiss, made absolutely certain her own children never wondered whether her heart was pointed at them. She broke the thing that had broken her. That's the whole victory, right there, and it's a quiet one, and it's worth more than every dollar the Commodore ever made. And there's a last little turn that I can't help loving, because it closes the circle so neatly. This woman, whose entire childhood had been torn apart over a trust fund, who had been valued as a key to money before she was valued as a girl, grew up to say, again and again, that she did not believe in leaving her children a great fortune to sit on. A trust fund, she felt, could be a kind of curse, a thing that hollowed a person out and taught them they were owed the world. She had, after all, seen exactly what an inheritance fought over can do to a child. So the money she'd made herself, by her own hand and her own eye, and she had her own firm ideas about what it should and shouldn't do to the people she loved. The child at the center of the trust fund trial of the century grew into a woman who looked the whole idea of inherited money in the eye and quietly turned her back on it. She'd learned, the hard way, the oldest truth there is. The things that actually hold a person up were never for sale. And the kettle finally rests. Now, at the last, I want to put those postcards back in your hands, the ones I asked you to remember at the very beginning of the night. Do you still have them? A child's careful looping handwriting, sent across an ocean to a grandmother. My mother is so bad to me, I wish I could run away to New York to you. We are moving again. Oh, what a life. When you hold this whole enormous story up to the light, all of it, the fortune and the trial and the 100 reporters and the marble mansions and the blue jeans and the 95 years, what it comes down to, what it always came down to, is a small girl trying to send her love across a distance too wide to cross, and hoping someone on the other side would send some back. That's the whole thing. That's every chapter of it. The trust fund, the custody war, the tabloids, they were all just the loud machinery that grew up around one quiet, unanswered question a child kept asking. Does anybody's whole heart point at me? 3 of them asked it. If you think about it, 3 generations of women in a line. Laura, raised to be a beautiful marriage, hardening into a woman who could spend her own daughters like coin. Gloria the mother, raised to be the same, reaching for warmth in ballrooms because no one had ever built her a home. And Gloria the child, the one we followed tonight, handed the same empty inheritance, and somehow, against every odd, choosing to break the line. Because here is the thing she did that neither her mother nor her grandmother managed. She built the warm house. She had her sons, and she loved them out loud, and she stayed. And when she was very old, she sat down with her boy and answered every question with her whole heart, so that at least one Gloria, at the end of at least one of these lives, would not have to send her love across an ocean and wait. The postcards finally got their answer. It just took 3 generations and 95 years, and a woman stubborn enough to become, at last, the mother she'd spent her whole childhood waiting for. And that, dear listener, is enough. That's more than enough. The fire settles, and the house goes quiet. Before I walk you back through it all and let you go, one last small thought to fold under your pillow. That phrase they hung on her, the poor little rich girl, followed Gloria Vanderbilt for the whole 95 years of her life, into every newspaper and every introduction, and, eventually, onto the spine of a best-selling book. It was meant, at first, as a kind of cruelty, dressed up as pity, a way for a hard-up country to feel a little superior to a fortune it could never touch. And she did with it what she did with everything life ever handed her. She outlived it. She lived so long and made so much of her own and loved so stubbornly that the label slowly lost its sting and became just the strange opening line of a much larger story, the story of a woman who was so much more than the saddest day of her childhood. The little girl the papers pitied grew into a woman it would have been foolish to pity. She'd have hated the pity anyway. What she wanted, all along, was simply to be seen, the whole of her, and to be loved on purpose. In the end, by the family she built, she was. And that, dear listener, is the note I want to leave ringing softly as you drift. The lamp gets carried, one last time, to the next room. So let's walk back through it now, slowly, the way you'd walk back through your own house before bed, turning off the lamps one by one. You saw a baby carried up a staircase while her father faded in an upstairs room. You saw a nurse named Dodo warm a bottle in the dark and stay, every night, for years. You saw a young mother cross an ocean once a month, chasing a warmth nobody had ever given her first. You saw the postcards, that small looping hand. Oh, what a life. You saw a sherry glass set down, and a child slipped out a side door to a waiting car. You saw the flashbulbs on the courthouse steps, and the crowd lined up in the cold. You saw a plain, fierce nurse on a witness stand, and a judge closing his doors against the noise, and a little girl in his chambers, saying the saddest, true thing a child can say, that no one had ever kissed her goodnight. You saw a verdict split a childhood into weekdays and weekends, and then you saw the girl grow and reach and lose and reach again, and finally, at long last, build the warm house she'd never been given, and fill it with children who always knew her heart was theirs. They were only people, all of them. That's the thing to carry off to sleep. Not villains and victims, whatever the newspapers wanted. Just people, proud and frightened and hopeful and wrong, loving imperfectly, reaching for each other across distances they didn't know how to close. The grandmother who spent her daughters, the mother who chased the light, the aunt who won and forgot, the nurse who loved too hard, and the little girl in the middle of all of it, who somehow grew up gentle anyway, and lived to be 95, and decided, against everything, to love her life. There's a kind of quiet courage in that which has nothing to do with fortunes at all. And now, as you lie here in your own ordinary bed, warm, with nothing pulling at your sleeve and no one arguing over you in any courtroom anywhere, let yourself feel how lucky that plain quiet really is. To belong to yourself, to have your own small room and your own soft dark and your own good night, with no writ, no reporters, no ocean in the way. Little Gloria would have traded every acre of Old Westbury for exactly the still, safe hour you're lying in right now. So rest easy. The flashbulbs burned out 90 years ago. The courtroom is long empty. The great houses are mostly dust, and every last one of those hurried, glittering, unhappy people is finally at peace. There's nothing left to decide tonight, and nobody to decide it. You have nowhere to be but sleep. Good night.